The day they dragged Marcus Lee into my prison, the smell of injustice walked right in with him. And trust me, I know the smell. I've been wearing it like cheap cologne for years. Warden Frank Halden had run Lockridge State Penitentiary for almost 2 decades. His reputation was carved in fear. Prisoners whispered his name like a curse, and guards straightened their backs when his boots clicked down the hallway. But the real story, the one people outside the barbed wire didn't know, was that Frank didn't just keep order. He manufactured it. Framed men, hidden evidence, deals with the dirtiest hands in the system, all wrapped in the American flag and law and order speeches that made reporters nod along. Marcus Lee was supposed to be just another file in the cabinet. 29 years old. Convicted for armed robbery and assault, except there was no weapon, no stolen money, and no solid witness. What there was, however, was Frank's signature on the final report that sealed Marcus's 20-year sentence. Frank had learned early in his career that a well-placed lie was more powerful than a nightstick. Marcus was perfect, young, black, from a poor neighborhood, no political connections. Easy to paint as a monster. Easy to disappear. Except Marcus didn't act like the other inmates Frank had framed. He didn't rage or plead or sink into despair. From the day he arrived, Marcus carried himself like a man who knew a truth too sharp to be ignored. He walked the yard with his head high, spoke in low, measured tones, and even the hardest prisoners seemed to listen when he talked. Frank hated him for that. The first clash came just 3 weeks in. Frank had arranged a disciplinary incident. 2 guards planted contraband in Marcus's cell, a shank and a small bag of pills. The paperwork was already filled out before they even found it. But when they marched Marcus to Frank's office, something went off script. "I didn't do this," Marcus said, calm but steady, his wrists cuffed in front of him. Frank leaned back in his chair, lips curling into the kind of smile that never touched his eyes. "You think that matters here?" "It matters everywhere," Marcus said. "Even here." That answer, so quietly defiant, dug under Frank's skin. He'd seen men break for less. But Marcus didn't just refuse to break. He started talking. To guards. To visiting lawyers. To anyone who'd listen. Rumors spread that he had evidence not just of his innocence, but of the warden's entire system of planted charges, illegal trades, and cover-ups. Frank responded the only way he knew how. More pressure. Marcus's cell was searched daily. His mail was lost. He was sent to solitary for a week on trumped-up charges of inciting violence. The warden thought isolation would crush him, but when Marcus came out, his eyes burned hotter than before. And then came the night that changed everything. A storm had knocked out half the prison's power. The halls were lit by backup generators, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. Frank was doing his usual patrol when a young guard, nervous, barely 23, intercepted him. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, shoving a thumb drive into Frank's hand. "What is it?" "Surveillance footage from 2 months ago, the day we found the shank in Lee's cell." Frank's gut tightened. He slipped into his office, locked the door, and plugged it in. The footage played, and there it was. Crystal clear. 2 guards, the ones he'd trusted, slipping into Marcus's cell with the contraband in plain view of the camera. No timestamp tampering. No camera glitch. Just raw truth. Frank's first instinct was to destroy it. But before he could, a voice spoke from the shadows of his office. "You can delete it," Marcus said, stepping forward, hands free of cuffs. "But it's already been copied. Sent out." Frank's breath caught. "Impossible," he said, trying to sound confident. Marcus's smile was small, almost pitying. "You think you're the only one who knows how to run a system?" In that moment, Frank realized 2 things. Marcus had outplayed him, and his own prison was about to become his cell. Frank stood frozen, the faint hum of the backup lights sounding like a roar in his ears. His fingers twitched toward the mouse, hovering over the delete icon, but he knew it was useless now. "You've got 5 minutes before this place changes forever," Marcus said, his voice low but deliberate. 5 minutes to decide whether you go out fighting or you go out lying." Frank's instincts screamed for control. "How the hell did you get in here without cuffs? Who let you out of your cell?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, as if Frank had just asked a child's question. "People talk, Warden. People you don't see. People you don't hear. Every man in here has something to lose and something to gain. You built your kingdom on fear, but you forgot fear can turn into hate. And hate, it's got a way of organizing itself." Outside the office, the storm raged. rattling the prison's thick steel bars. Frank's mind raced through 1,000 scenarios. The footage couldn't just be in Marcus's hands if he'd come here tonight. It meant it was already somewhere safe. "You're bluffing," Frank said, forcing a smirk. "If you had anything, the cops would be swarming this place already." Marcus stepped closer, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the warden's desk. "You think the cops want this?" "Some do, some don't. But the people outside, they're different now. They've been watching, listening. I've had a reporter on my visiting list for 6 months. We've been trading chess moves." "Your move, Warden?" Frank's pulse hammered in his neck. He'd heard about Marcus's chess games, always calm, always 3 steps ahead. But he hadn't realized the games weren't just games. The phone on Frank's desk rang sharply, making both men flinch. Frank picked it up. "Halden," he barked. It was Captain Miller, head of the guard unit. "Sir, we've got reporters outside the south gate. TV vans. They're demanding entry." And his voice lowered. "Sir, someone's posting videos online, accusing us of planting evidence, naming you directly." Frank's hand tightened on the receiver. "Keep them out. No one talks. Understand?" He slammed the phone down and turned back to Marcus, but the inmate was gone. Gone. Frank rushed to the door, scanning the dim hallway, but there was nothing but flickering lights and the sound of distant thunder. By morning, the prison was boiling. Guards whispered in corners. Inmates banged on cell doors, shouting Marcus's name like a rallying cry. On the outside, hashtags were trending, news anchors were debating, and protesters were gathering in front of Lockridge's gates. Frank tried to play his usual game: denial, intimidation, burying the story under legal jargon, but the ground was shifting beneath him. A subpoena landed on his desk within 48 hours. They wanted all surveillance footage for the past year. He summoned Captain Miller. "Miller, I need that hard drive gone. All of it. Accidents happen, a flood, a power surge, I don't care how." Miller hesitated. "Sir, I don't think that's wise. The Attorney General's office is already sniffing around." And he glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "The men are scared. Some think you're going down, and they don't want to go with you." Frank's jaw tightened. "You tell them loyalty is the only thing keeping them from wearing orange." But Miller didn't look convinced. That was when Frank realized the most dangerous thing about Marcus Lee wasn't his alleged evidence, it was the way he'd gotten into people's heads. On the 3rd day, Frank was called to testify in a closed-door hearing. The prosecutor was young, sharp, and, to Frank's annoyance, black. Her name was Dana Cross, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Warden Halden, can you explain why surveillance footage from Lockridge State shows 2 of your officers entering Marcus Lee's cell without a warrant or cause?" Frank leaned back, adopting his most practiced smirk. "Ma'am, in a prison environment, there's no such thing as without cause. Every cell search is for the safety of the institution." Dana's eyes didn't even blink. "And would you consider planting a weapon in an inmate's cell to be for the safety of the institution?" Frank's smirk faltered. "I don't deal in hypotheticals." "This isn't hypothetical," Dana said, sliding a photograph across the table. It was a still frame from the footage, one of his guards, clearly holding the shank, entering Marcus's cell. "This is fact." Frank kept his voice even. "If that happened, and I'm not saying it did, then those officers acted alone. Without my knowledge." Dana leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "The problem with that, Warden, is that we have emails. Yours. Approving the search, down to the exact time. Would you like me to read them into the record?" For the first time in years, Frank felt heat rising to his face. He stayed silent. Dana smiled faintly. "No? Then let me save us all some time. You've got 2 options: cooperate or watch this whole institution burn with you inside it. And believe me, people will light the match." Back in his office, Frank slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. His hands trembled, not with fear or so he told himself, but with rage. He poured himself a drink, staring at the dark liquid like it might give him an answer. Then his computer pinged. A new email. No subject, just a link. Against his better judgment, he clicked it. The screen filled with video after video, guards beating inmates, planting evidence, laughing about it. Some of the faces were his most loyal men. In some clips, he himself appeared, giving nods of approval or signing off on reports. At the bottom of the email was one line. "The truth is patient, but not forever." By the end of the week, the walls had truly started closing in. The governor announced a full investigation. The Department of Justice was circling, and Frank had received word that Marcus's conviction had been overturned. He would walk free within days. But Marcus didn't wait for freedom to come to him. He requested a meeting, and to Frank's shock, the request was approved. They sat across from each other in the same office where Frank had once tried to break him. "You think you've won," Frank said, voice low, controlled. Marcus leaned forward. "I didn't do this to win, Warden. I did it so no one else has to sit in a cell because of you." Frank's jaw worked. "You'll make me the villain, but you have no idea what it takes to run this place. You think the public wants the truth? They want safety. They want the bad guys locked up." Marcus's eyes hardened. "Safety for who? Men like you? You don't get to decide who the bad guys are. That's the whole problem." Frank looked away, but Marcus kept talking. "One day soon, they're going to walk you through those gates. You'll be in chains, and you'll finally understand what it feels like to have your life decided by a man who doesn't care if you're guilty or not." For the first time, Frank had no answer. The news broke on a gray Monday morning. Every local station carried the same headline: Lockridge Warden under federal investigation, wrongful convictions linked to racist practices. Frank sat in his office, the blinds drawn, a cigarette burning down to the filter between his fingers. The calls came in nonstop: lawyers, old political allies, reporters he'd once controlled. He ignored them all. The one message he couldn't ignore came from Captain Miller. "They're here. DOJ. They've got warrants." Frank didn't panic. Not outwardly. He'd built his career on staying calm while the building burned. But when the investigators walked into his office, badges flashing under the fluorescent light, he understood that this time, the fire was consuming him. "Franklin Halden," the lead agent said, "we're here to seize all records, digital and physical, relating to inmate disciplinary actions, conviction reports, and surveillance footage over the last 10 years. Frank stood, straightened his tie. "This is still my prison," he said. The agent didn't blink. Not anymore. They boxed up his files, unplugged his computer, even took the framed photo of him shaking hands with the governor. When they left, the office felt like a corpse stripped of anything that made it his. Marcus was released the next morning. The air outside Lockridge was sharp with early spring, and the crowd waiting for him was larger than he'd imagined: reporters, activists, even a few of the men he'd served time with who'd since been freed. Cameras clicked like gunfire as he stepped forward. A young woman pushed through the crowd and hugged him. "Dana Cross. Welcome back to the world, Marcus," she said. He smiled faintly. "I never really left. Just had a bad landlord." The crowd laughed, but Dana's expression stayed serious. "This isn't over. Halden's still got people protecting him. He's dangerous." Marcus nodded. "I know. That's why I'm not done yet." Inside Lockridge, Frank was facing a different kind of crowd. Guards who'd once followed his orders without question now avoided his eyes. A few smirked openly as he passed. Word had spread that the Attorney General's office was preparing to charge him not just with evidence tampering, but with civil rights violations charges that carried real prison time. Frank called in every favor he had left, but most of his friends suddenly weren't answering the phone. A few sent polite, useless texts about hoping for the best and keeping in touch. When the indictment came, it was brutal. 27 counts, each one a nail in the coffin of his career. The headline in the Lockridge Gazette read, "Warden Halden indicted, faces 40 years." The trial began 6 months later. Marcus sat in the gallery every day, his presence a quiet but constant reminder of the man Frank had tried to destroy. He never spoke to reporters, never made speeches. He just watched. The prosecution was relentless. Dana Cross, now leading the case, laid out a pattern of racial bias so detailed it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Black inmates receiving harsher punishments, fabricated charges, longer solitary confinement, more frequent parole denials. The footage of guards planting evidence in Marcus's cell was played for the jury twice. When Frank took the stand in his own defense, he tried to regain the swagger that had once made him untouchable. "I ran a tight ship," he said. "I kept dangerous men off the streets. I did my job." Dana rose for cross-examination. "Your job, Mr. Halden, was to uphold the law, not rewrite it, not decide who deserved freedom based on the color of their skin." Frank bristled. "I never made decisions based on race." Dana clicked a remote, and the courtroom screen lit up with a chart as stark, undeniable breakdown of disciplinary actions by race over 10 years. The disparity was overwhelming. "Then how do you explain this?" she asked. Frank stared at the chart, but the numbers didn't blink. The jury did, though slowly, in a way that told him they'd already made up their minds. Marcus left the courthouse that day knowing the verdict was coming, and it would not be in Frank's favor. But he also knew something deeper. This wasn't just about one man going to prison. It was about the system that had allowed Frank to thrive for so long. That night, he sat down for his first public interview. "I'm not here because of one bad man," Marcus told the reporter. "I'm here because the system made it easy for that man to be bad. If we just swap him out for someone else and don't change the system, we're going to be right back here in 10 years. When the verdict came in, the courtroom was silent. On the count of evidence tampering, guilty. On the count of conspiracy to violate civil rights, guilty. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. Not when the sentence was read, 35 years without parole. Not when the bailiffs moved to cuff him. It wasn't until his belt and tie were removed, until the cold click of steel closed around his wrists, that his expression cracked. And when they walked him through the same gates he'd ruled over for 20 years, past the same cells where men he'd framed still sat, the voices rose like a tide. Some shouted curses. Others just laughed. And somewhere in the noise, he heard Marcus's voice, calm, steady, impossible to ignore. "Now you know." Frank's cell was small, the mattress thin, the light harsh. The first night, he lay awake listening to the sounds of the prison he'd once commanded, the clang of gates, the distant shouts, the occasional scrape of metal on concrete. He thought about all the times he'd told himself he was keeping order. He thought about the faces of the men whose lives he'd destroyed. He thought about Marcus, walking free under an open sky. And for the first time, Frank Halden understood that his sentence wasn't measured in years. It was measured in everything he'd taken from others and could never give back. The first 6 months of Frank Halden's sentence were the hardest, not because of the conditions, but because of the silence. Prison has a way of stripping you down to the parts you can't lie to. In the beginning, Frank tried to play the role of the tough, unshaken man, the ex-warden who wouldn't bend. But there's no prestige in being a fallen king. The guards treated him with thinly veiled contempt, and the inmates, well, they treated him exactly as he had once treated them. The first time he was shoved in the yard, it wasn't about revenge, it was about establishing a new order. The second time, it was personal. He learned to keep his eyes low, his voice lower, and his meals quick. But the nights were worse. Nights carried memories. He thought about the hundreds of files he had signed without looking past the color of the face in the mugshot. He thought about the incidents he had staged to keep his statistics clean, the evidence he had allowed to disappear, the parole hearings he had tanked because of a grudge or a gut feeling. And every so often, he thought about Marcus Lee not as an enemy, but as a man who had warned him. Marcus, meanwhile, was building something bigger than himself. With the help of Dana Cross and a small team of legal volunteers, he started the Clear Path Project, an organization dedicated to reviewing wrongful convictions and exposing systemic racial bias in sentencing. The first year, they freed 4 men. By the second, they had 10 cases in active appeals. Reporters wanted him to make it personal, to talk about Frank as his nemesis, to frame it like a revenge story. Marcus refused. "This isn't about one man," he told them over and over. "If you make it about him, you miss the point. We're not here to swap one warden for another. We're here to make sure there's nothing to swap." Still, the image of him standing outside the courthouse the day Frank was sentenced, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable, became iconic. It ended up on protest posters, magazine covers, even murals in some neighborhoods. 2 years into Frank's sentence, Marcus visited Lockridge. Not for revenge, not for satisfaction, for a deal. They met in a small, windowless interview room. Frank looked older, the lines on his face deeper, his posture more hunched. The orange jumpsuit didn't just strip him of authority, it made him anonymous. "You look better than I expected," Marcus said, taking a seat. Frank's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "I want records," Marcus said plainly. "Names, dates, everything you've got on wrongful convictions. Not just mine. All of them." Frank barked a short, humorless laugh. "Why the hell would I help you?" Marcus leaned forward. "Because you've got 2 choices. Rot in here as the man who built this place on lies, or leave behind something worth remembering." You can't undo what you've done, but you can stop some of it from continuing. Frank stared at him for a long time. And if I don't? Marcus shrugged. Then you die in here, same as everyone else. Forgotten. It took 3 weeks, but Frank agreed. The information he provided broke open 17 cases, all men of color, all convicted under suspicious circumstances during his tenure. Some had already served decades. A few walked free within months. Marcus didn't thank him. He didn't have to. Frank understood. The last time they saw each other was 5 years after Frank's sentencing. Marcus had come to deliver news. The state was dismantling Lockridge. The prison would be shut down, the land repurposed into a rehabilitation and education center for at-risk youth. They're tearing it down, Marcus said, almost as if testing the words. Frank nodded slowly. Good. There was a long silence. Finally, Frank spoke again. I used to think a man could hold on to power forever if he was smart enough. But the truth is you don't own power. You just borrow it from the people it affects. And one day, they come to take it back. Marcus stood. Guess today's that day. Months later, Frank died quietly in his sleep, still in prison. There was no ceremony, no obituary in the Gazette, just a file closed and a number retired. Marcus heard the news while working late at the Clearpath office. He sat for a moment, thinking about the man, the warden, the enemy, the unlikely source of justice for men he'd never met. Then he picked up the next case file. Because the work wasn't done. On the day the demolition crews arrived at Lockridge, Marcus stood outside the gates with a small crowd. The first wall came down with a groan of steel and a cloud of dust. People cheered, but Marcus didn't. He watched in silence, the wind pulling at his coat, the past crumbling brick by brick. When the dust cleared, he turned to Dana, who stood beside him. You know, he said, some people think justice is a gavel. I think it's a seed. You plant it, you water it, and you hope it grows where it's needed most. Dana smiled faintly. Then I guess we've got a lot more planting to do. Marcus looked back at the rubble one last time. Yeah, he said softly. We do. And with that, he walked away from Lockridge for the last time, not as a freed man, not as a victim, but as someone who had turned a weapon meant to destroy him into a tool for change. Because the truth was patient, but not forever. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.